my name's Lisa Ott. I'm the president of the North Shore Land Alliance. We're a land trust that works in western Long Island, New York. And yes, Long Island is an island surrounded by water. In addition to that, we sit on top of a sole source aquifer, which is responsible for all of our drinking water. We're a coastal community, and as you know, coastal communities are going to be impacted by climate change much sooner than the rest of the country. And impacted we already are. We have salt water intruding into our aquifer, and we have nitrogen pollution that's wreaking havoc on our beaches and bays. We must talk about climate change, and it's, as you all also know, it's probably hasn't been very easy to talk about in some communities. But for land trusts, particularly because saving land and better managing it is part of the solution, climate change is something that we need to talk about now, and we need to talk about it loudly. I've watched the founders of the Seachange conversation, who would be the presenters of this session, for the last 5 years. I've watched as they developed Seachange into a powerful nonpartisan education resource on climate change for moderates and conservatives alike. And I've watched them for a reason. It was important to choose just the right people to bring the message to our community. And that they did. They've actually come to speak with us twice, and they presented climate change factually. They presented it in a science-based way, and they were not threatening to the people of our community. So in effect, I am so grateful to the Seachange ladies for what they've done for our community, because we are talking about it and we are doing things to mitigate and abate it. I'd like to introduce you to Kathleen Biggins. Kathleen is the founder of the Seachange Conversation. She had the idea to create this nonpartisan climate change education organization, and she used her talents as a broadcaster to develop the Seachange Primer, which has now been seen by 10,000 people. She's brilliant at using apolitical language to present scientific and economic information on climate change that resonates with many conservatives. She'll be joined by Katie Kinsolving. Katie was one of the co-founders of Seachange Conversations. She has a background in the food industry and specializes on the relationships between food and climate and the food industry in general. The Seachange Conversation has been presented to audiences across the country, not only on the North Shore of Long Island, but also in California, Louisiana, Mississippi, Kentucky, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, places where talking about climate change is really hard, Oregon, Texas, and Illinois. In addition to land trusts like mine, they've worked with the Nature Conservancy and Audubon and welcome the opportunity to share the secrets of their success with you. Enjoy.
Thank you, Lisa, for that wonderful introduction. It is both a privilege and a pleasure to be presenting to the Land Trust Alliance. My name is Kathleen Biggins, and I am the president and founder of Seachange Conversations.
And I'm Katie Kinsolving, a co-founder of Seachange Conversations.
Katie and I, together with two other women, Pam Mount and Carrie Dykeman, began Seachange Conversations in 2014 with the express purpose of reaching out to moderates and conservatives and bringing them into the conversation around climate change. We recognize that so many of our peers, our colleagues, and our loved ones did not fully understand the risk. Many of them thought of it as an environmental issue or a liberal issue, something that impacted far-off animals or would only impact humans in far-off time. In fact, social scientists said there was a spiral of silence around the issue, almost a taboo of bringing it up. But we recognize that if we do not come together, we will not be able to forge the solutions that will keep our civilization safe, and that we needed to bring in this important constituency so that they too could understand the risk, understand that they had skin in the game, and bring solutions to the table. In short, we set out to wake them up without turning them off. One of our most successful initiatives has been the Seachange Conversation Primer. This is a PowerPoint that I wrote with climate scientists and energy experts. It shows a 360-degree view, translating the science without dumbing it down, but also touching on the economic, business, national security, and personal health ramifications of the issue. We presented it first to garden clubs in the Princeton area because we recognize that those garden clubs, which were members of the Garden Club of America network, contained our perfect target. Many of those members are moderates and conservatives and shy away from discussing political issues. But they were also people who loved the outdoors, who were outside in their gardens and seeing changes. And we hoped they would be curious enough about why those changes were happening to open their ears and listen to our presentation. Our PowerPoint was met with great success, and those garden clubs recommended us to the GCA headquarters in New York. Once GCA headquarters heard the presentation, they asked us to open their national conference that year and have invited us back for the last 3 successive years. And in doing so, delegates from around the country have heard our presentation and valued its nonpartisan and scientific approach and invited us to bring that presentation to their communities, to their garden clubs, also to other associations, and sometimes even to the public. And since then, we have now traveled on planes, trains, and automobiles to 30 states and presented to over 10,000 people. And perhaps the greatest testament is that when we are in a marketplace, we are almost inevitably asked to come back and present to other groups. At this point, we have been invited to present to the Young Presidents Organization, World Affairs Council, businesses, business and investment clubs, Rotary clubs, chambers of commerce, arboretums, land trusts, country clubs, churches and schools, and even in private homes. And we are training others across the country to give this presentation so that we can expand our reach and impact. And this was all done on volunteer power, and a volunteer group that spans the political spectrum from liberals to conservatives, because we want to ensure that our approach is nonpartisan. So let's take a look at what we've learned over the last 5 years. But before we start, I'd like to recommend that you look to the Land Trust Alliance website. There's lots of very good information on how to broach this topic with your constituency, and a lot of very interesting research, so please take a look. For us, we've learned some rather surprising things. The first thing I will say is that we have learned that tone and manner is more important than content. Sounds heretical. But social scientists say that climate change is such a politicized issue that it's one that we hear about or judge first with our hearts and then use our heads to validate what our hearts have said. And so no matter how good our facts or figures may be, we will not persuade somebody if we haven't created an opening. And that opening is created when you seem to be a credible and likable messenger, a trusted messenger, if you will. One of the things that we found very helpful is to put ourselves in our audience's place. Perhaps there is a topic that you feel very strongly about, perhaps protecting the police or immigration or abortion. And consider what it would feel like if you knew you were going to a presentation to hear someone else who had a different point of view. You would walk in a guarded fashion. Your arms may be closed, your heart may be closed, and your ears may be shut. What you need to do first is create that corridor of trust so that they will be willing to listen. And we have found that if you approach something with the right tone and manner, you can actually say some pretty challenging things, as long as it's not seen as a harangue or a lecture. Let's take a look at our introduction, and you can see we don't shy away from confronting some pretty important beliefs. Whenever we walk into a room to talk about climate change, we recognize that we do not walk in alone. We walk in with 3 800-pound gorillas with us. And the first 800-pound gorilla is the fact that we all know that the climate has always been changing due to natural causes. We've had ice ages, we've had crocodiles in the Arctic, but this time scientists say it's different. That man is triggering this change after a period of remarkable stability. And we are doing it at a time when there are 7 billion of us on the planet, close to 10 billion projected by mid-century. And we can't just pick up our lean-tos and follow the food and water resources as they react to a changing climate. The second 800-pound gorilla in the room with us is the fact that fossil fuels have been incredible friends to us. Before we discovered them, our lives were short and brutal. They have given us a vibrant economy and a very high quality of life. But scientists say. If we continue to use them the way we have in the past, they will begin to do the opposite, actually decrease our GDP and lower the quality of life, especially for our kids and our grandkids. And the third 800-pound gorilla in the room with us is that this is a tough, tough topic to talk about. Perhaps it is banned from your Thanksgiving table. It was from mine for many years. But it hasn't always been thus. George W. Bush proposed a cap-and-trade approach to solve climate change in his first year of office. There were multiple bipartisan bills introduced to Congress every single year. In 2007, the Republican Congressman Newt Gingrich did a commercial supporting cap-and-trade with Nancy Pelosi. And in 2008, it was on the presidential platforms of both parties. Different ways of addressing it, but agreeing that it needed to be addressed. So what happened? Well, scientists who were active during that period tell us that when Al Gore won the Nobel Peace Prize for his movie on climate change, An Inconvenient Truth, it was a watershed moment. Something that had begrudging acceptance across the aisle suddenly became labeled as a liberal issue. And we had a new litmus test for what made a good liberal or a good conservative. And the news media didn't help. Many on the far left began to say that we needed to be anti-cow, anti-car, and anti-capitalist in order to address climate change. And on the right, they really began to cover it more as a culture war issue instead of a scientific issue. Research shows that Fox News in 2006 had about 50% of their coverage saying that climate change was real and posed problems. By 2009, 90% said it was a hoax. So we had a real hardening across party lines. But if you fast forward to today, the vast majority of Americans understand climate change is happening. A strong majority understand that it is being influenced by man. But what Americans across the spectrum report is that they do not understand how climate change will impact them personally, nor why there is urgency to address it. And that is what this presentation is meant to address. Now, we are not scientists, but we worked very closely with scientists and energy policy experts to develop this presentation. And it has been vetted by climate experts at Duke, at Rutgers, at Princeton, at Tufts, and at Yale. Now, one of the groups that we follow very, very closely is the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication. And about 4 years ago, they came out with a presentation that said that Americans across the spectrum have 5 major questions on climate change. And we decided to use those 5 questions to structure this presentation. So what are these questions that most Americans have? Well, the first one is, how do we know it's real? The second, how do we know it's us? The third, what do the scientists think? The fourth, is it dangerous? And the fifth, is there hope? So let's jump into that first question. How do we know that climate change is really happening? So as you can see in that introduction, we did not shy away from some very important points. The fact that the climate has always been changing and meeting people at that point and moving them through it. The fact that fossil fuels have really built an incredible economy for us and played an important part in our quality of life, agreeing to that and moving through it. And of course, the last one, delving into why this is so partisan today and the fact that it wasn't always such. And this is a very important part of our introduction. I can't tell you how many times afterwards I hear that a light bulb has gone off when people understand how it became so politicized. And that, again, allows people to move away from the politicization and actually embrace some of the presentation we're going to share with them as we go. The other thing that we do here is introduce our 5 questions. And that's going to be very important as we talk about our content. So let's drill down a little bit more on our tone and manner. First, we want to establish a personal connection wherever possible. We always try to get into a market a day or 2 before we have to present so that we can get to know our sponsors and they can get to know us. We try to look and sound like them, dress in a way that fits into their group, We also try to go to them in their settings, and oftentimes that is a semi-social settings because we're going to their group meetings. So if we're going to a garden club, this is their monthly meeting. They're there for their meeting and to hear whatever speaker it is. And what? It's a climate change speaker. And they sit and they listen and they see that their peers are listening. And they see that their peers may be nodding and asking really good questions. And suddenly they are part of that group as well. And it helps them move away from feeling like they shouldn't believe or endorse this topic. Another thing we found is obviously be nonpartisan and non-confrontational. And so throughout our presentation, we do not take sides. We make sure that we talk about either issues on the left and the right and that we are very even-handed. We treat them respectfully and allow them to make their own conclusions. And this is really important. We presented this presentation to the former head of the American Bar Association. And he said our presentation is almost like someone who is laying it out for a jury, putting out compelling facts and bringing them along in understanding, but letting them make up their own minds. And I think that's a really critical part of successfully starting this conversation and bringing people along. And then another thing that we have learned that helps quite a lot is to use rhetorical questions or actual questions that the audience will then call out and answer to include them. So it's much more of a dialogue or conversation, if you will, than a lecture. So let's look at another clip from the middle of our presentation. This is after we have talked about how we know it's real, how we know it's us, how strong the scientific consensus, and about to lead into the dangers. Let's take a listen. Now, I'd like to take a minute and ask you to think about how you normally evaluate risk in your life. If you're like most of us, we divide it into three pieces. The first piece is, how likely is it to happen? Well, we just saw the Arctic Ocean melting away with our own eyes, and we just saw that NASA says 97% or more of climate scientists are saying it's happening. So I think we can check that box. The second part of the risk assessment normally is, so what are the consequences if it comes to pass? Can I live with them, or are they things that I really want to avoid? And the third part of that risk assessment normally is, how difficult or expensive is it to avoid that risk? Would you guys agree? Yeah. So let's jump into that second part of the risk assessment. What could the consequences be? And are we comfortable living with them if they indeed come to pass? And to do that, we need to move to our next question: is it dangerous? Now, I'd like to take a moment to orient you to this slide because I believe this is the most important slide in the presentation because it shows the big picture. So on the x-axis, we have time from today back 20,000 years. On the y-axis, we have temperature in Fahrenheit, so it's quick for us to read. The yellow line is average global temperature, and the white are more or less milestones to give us reference points. So as you can see, 20,000 years ago, we were in the middle of an ice age. There was a mile of ice above Manhattan. The southernmost glacier ended just north of my hometown of Princeton. Much of the earth was uninhabitable. But over about 10,000 years, nature moderated, and the temperature rose to what has been the average global temperature more or less for the last 10,000 years, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And once we arrived there, we had the emergence of agriculture. This little bump is when Mesopotamia flourished. This little hill, perhaps a full degree, is when the Vikings were able to grow vegetables in Greenland during the medieval warming period. This divot, perhaps a degree and a half, was the little ice age that caused such deprivation and food shortages and upheaval. And then we see the temperature going up and away, landing somewhere between 3.6 and 10.8 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of this century, depending on what we choose to do. So let's think about that. 8,000 years for nature to moderate, to literally march trees from Mexico to Montana to create the ecosystems and the biodiversity that we depend on. 10,000 years of remarkable stability. And then Man, through our activities, are triggering potentially that same delta in temperature in 100 years. That's scary, right? And that is what brought all the countries of the world together to say, we can't go there. We need to keep the temperature at the 3.6 level, which correlates to the 2 degrees Celsius we read about in the press, or even better at the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal, because we think at those levels we can mitigate, we can adapt, and we can be okay. But above that, we aren't so sure. So let's take a look at what these natural systems are that are being changed by climate change. But as we do so, I'd like you to evaluate these changes through 3 specific lenses. And the first one is, how will these changes affect the economy and jobs in your area? The second is, how will they impact health and personal security? And the last is, how will they impact your exposure to geopolitical instability, which we experience as civil chaos, refugee flows, and terrorism? Anybody in the audience want to take a guess as why I'm asking you to look through these 3 lenses? Anybody? Because these are the 3 things that Americans say are most important to them when they vote. And we believe that climate change will negatively and profoundly impact all 3. Let's see if you agree. Let's take a quick look at temperature. This graphic from NASA shows how global average temperature has changed from pre-industrial times to today. When it is blue, it is colder than average, white average, yellow warmer, red hotter. So as you can see, at the end, the red really comes crescendoing in. And that's because we aren't just breaking records, we're really shattering them. As you can see from this graphic, the 5 hottest years on record globally have been the last 5. And we just experienced the hottest June ever recorded. But that's looking backwards. What's happening on the ground today? Well, for one thing, our friends down in Australia had to add the color purple to their national heat map because they are routinely forecasting temperatures above 125 degrees Fahrenheit. But what does it mean for us in the future? Well, Climate Central, which is a nonpartisan scientific group, took a look at what summers in New York could be like if we continue on our current path. And they averaged 26 different models to do so, not just taking the worst case scenario. And what we see is that if we continue to emit carbon the way we have, our summers in New York will be 9.5 degrees hotter and feel like summers in Lehigh Acres, Florida by the end of this century. Another thing that Climate Central looks at is danger days. And danger days are days when the heat and humidity hit 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's a critical point because it's there that we can no longer sweat to cool off our bodies and it becomes dangerous to be outside. We've all experienced that recently when we heard of the excessive heat warnings just this past summer. It's an important time because municipalities have to set up cooling centers, and it means that we cannot be outside for recreation or for work. They are lost days. Well, in the New York region, we don't experience that very often today, but looking forward, it is projected that we could have up to 17 days in about a decade and a full month by mid-century if we continue on our current path. So I know that I said that tone and manner was the most important thing, but content still is critically important. It still matters. And we have found that that 5-question format works extraordinarily well. We learned about it from the Yale program on climate change communication. And the reason we think it works so well is that it meets people psychically wherever they are. Perhaps they are full-out denier, and we give them some very concrete information that kind of shares with them why it can't be so, that it is indeed happening. Well, then perhaps it's happening, but it's not man-made. Again, we address that. Well, if it was really serious, the scientists would all be shouting the alarm. We tell them that they are and address how they can understand that in a way that is persuasive and, again, not lecturing. And then we ask them to consider this the way they would other risks in their lives and move to the danger sections for those who are saying, well, maybe it is, but how alarmed should I be? And then we move lastly to those who are really terrified about the issue and give them hope that there are actions we can take today to mitigate the issues of the future. We also only present science from very credible sources. We use a lot of source material from NASA and NOAA because those are two entities that many people look to keep themselves safe in other situations. We also, as you could see in that clip, really hit hard on the fact that climate change isn't an environmental issue, but indeed impacts things that all humans care about, and especially moderates and conservative, things like our economy and our jobs, things like security and personal safety, and of course, geopolitical stability. We provide evidence that they can see with their own eyes. I can't tell you how impactful that NASA graphic is when people see the Earth temperature going up and moving from blue into that deep red. There is another slide that we use, which is a graphic from NOAA that shows how the Arctic Ocean mature ice is melting away. That too is a very impactful slide. Let's take a quick look. When people see these two graphics, seeing climate change with their own eyes, it is incredibly impactful. Most times our audience either gasps or begins to talk amongst themselves when they see this. And afterwards we hear that these two visuals are very impactful. Another thing that we do is we tailor it to each individual market. As you saw there, we had tailored it to a New York market. All of our danger day slides, how hot it will be in the future, is tailored to the market. As we go into the dangers, we look to the dangers that are most prevalent in that region. And later in the health section, we look to what diseases are spread by mosquitoes and are spread for more days in each market. So again, tailoring it so they feel more that they have skin in the game. And we also always show solutions. We do not end on despair. We tell them that there are many solutions, both natural and technological, that we can embrace to make our future safer. And lastly, we highlight that the cost of inaction is much greater than the cost of action, and hit that economic story very, very hard in our last section, which is there hope? I'd also like to talk a moment about using appropriate language. One of the really important things that we have found is that we have to use language that lay people understand, and that we have to avoid using scientific jargon. It puts a barrier between us and the audience. We also like to use personal stories, humor, and emotion, but judiciously. And one of the things I read, which surprised me, is that actually conservatives resonate more towards these types of messages even than liberals do, which is why Senator Inhofe's act of tossing a frozen snowball in the middle of the Senate was so powerful and resonated so well with so many conservatives, and shut out the idea that climate change really could be happening. We also use words that conservatives like, words like prudence, stewardship, self-reliance, and responsibility. We talk about the fact that we are on this earth for a short while, and we have a moral obligation to leave the earth at least as good as we received it, and also about the fact that we are responsible for ourselves. We do not want to leave to our children and grandchildren a mess that we have created. We highlight that other conservatives, including Kevin McCarthy or James Baker, care about this issue and are asking the Republicans to take action. And we recognize that there are conservative solutions. In our presentation, we touch on nuclear, carbon capture, and of course, tree planting. which is carbon capture through natural resources. And of course, we always end on an optimistic note and let our audience know it's not too late, and if they come together, we can take action that will change the course of the future. Now, I know that I have given you a lot to think about, but I would like to reassure you that this approach really does work. I don't want to blow our own horn, but I would like to share with you this testimonial from a Florida resident. And this Florida resident has a summer house up on Long Island that was creamed by Hurricane Sandy. In fact, the whole house was filled with sand. And yet, even after that occurrence, he did not believe that climate change was really an issue until he saw our presentation. And here's the testimonial that he shared with us. As a lifelong conservative, I've always been a bit skeptical of the global warming doomsayers. However, I must say, after listening to Kathleen Biggin's presentation of the science and effect of climate change, I was blown away by the potential implication of global warming in the not too distant future. Regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, I would highly recommend that you listen to this presentation, as it is well worth your time. Thank you for listening to our presentation so far, and I'd like now to change up the topic and focus a little bit more on how land trusts have an important role in fostering this conversation. I will hand it over to my colleague, Katie Kinsolving.
Thank you, Kathleen. Scientists agree natural climate solutions can provide over a third of the strategies we need to mitigate climate change impacts by 2030. Land trusts are in a unique position to promote, enhance, and implement many of these nature-based solutions, solutions that also happen to clean the air and water, increase the vitality of our soil, and preserve biodiversity. The way we use land is both a cause of climate change and a solution. Land use has contributed to climate change through massive deforestation, particularly in our tropical forests, and most forests were cut down to make room for grazing and cropland. In fact, we use approximately half of the world's habitable land in order to grow food. We've also drained off wetlands to make room for farmland. All told, our agriculture is responsible for 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Urban and suburban sprawl and transportation infrastructure are also facets of land use that are contributing to climate change. On the flip side, land preservation is one of the most potent tools in our toolbox to address climate change. We cannot rely on land preservation alone, but it has distinct advantages. Land is here now and available now. It's cost-effective. Much of what we need to do is to let the land be. It doesn't require technology and massive infrastructure to work. Preserving the land can help in three ways. It can help by storing carbon, by reducing emissions, and by developing resiliency. You are on the front line of this work of land stewardship. Scientists, economists, regional planners, and other nonprofits are developing increasingly effective tools to help you. Scientists can now measure carbon sequestration and storage capacity of nature-based systems. There are models that can predict emissions from land use changes. We have new criteria available to inform land acquisition decisions so that those decisions can be based on a broad cross-section of data, from climate resiliency to carbon storage to protecting biodiversity. And we have new tools to help communities look at and manage risk and build resiliency in local areas in the face of climate change, because each community is going to be experiencing climate change differently. So I want to give you a couple of examples of land trusts and local governments that are already using some of these tools. And I'm going to start with carbon storage. The Texas Coastal Exchange is my poster child today for carbon storage. But to be honest, many other organizations are jumping on the carbon storage and carbon credit bandwagon, and more about carbon credits in a minute. The Texas Coastal Exchange pays private landowners along the Texas coast to maintain and protect carbon-rich wetland. In other words, to do nothing to it. The amount of each landowner's grant is based on the size of their property, the type of ecosystem that the property contains, and how much carbon dioxide it can store. At the same time, the Texas Coastal Exchange is giving grants to local nonprofits that are replanting coastal wetlands in the Galveston Bay. So they're doing two jobs, really: keeping carbon stored in the wetlands and then redeveloping new wetlands to increase resilience. Texas Coastal Exchange is funded by donors looking for carbon credits. This is a formula that is being increasingly used across the country within a variety of ecosystems, from the coastal wetlands like those in Texas, to the Great Plains, to northern forests, to farms large and small around the country. If your land trust is not on the carbon credit bandwagon, that is something you may want to investigate. Smart stewardship of the land can also help reduce emissions. I often speak about reducing emissions through the lens of agricultural practices. And to be sure, researchers are studying how we can reduce agricultural emissions through methods such as cover cropping and no-till and reduced fertilizer use. But I'd like you to step out of that agricultural silo with me for a moment and think across silos. What about using degraded farmland and other types of property to plant a different type of sun-loving crop, to plant solar fields and wind farms? Yes, this may be controversial in your area, but again, there are those who've gone before who have created a process. New York State's Scenic Hudson has created a guide to siting renewable energy sites. The Land Trust Alliance itself has several excellent posts on its website about how land conservation organizations can broker impressive green infrastructure deals for solar fields that mean reduced emissions for an entire region. In West Texas, ranchers and farmers have turned their degraded grazing lands into wind farms. Often these deals include planting native vegetation around the solar fields in order to prevent erosion and revitalize the soil and build resiliency. Resiliency. Let's talk about how land stewardship and preservation can support climate resiliency. Preserving land now is critical to ensuring that we preserve the ecosystems that support human and other life forms. For some municipalities, resiliency means protecting residents from the next storm. In Morris County, New Jersey, they are prioritizing land acquisition in HSAs, hydrologically sensitive areas, essentially creating a fund to help buy back houses that are vulnerable to flooding. Resiliency planning can take many forms. In Princeton, New Jersey, one of the local land trusts is working with other nonprofits to assess parcels available for preservation, appraising each available parcel based on a set of criteria that addresses global and local issues, including carbon sequestration potential, tree cover, and most critically for Princeton, stormwater runoff mitigation. The Open Space Institute has created a manual of sorts for identifying and preserving those properties that are going to be the most climate resilient. And I believe the Land Trust Alliance has helped to disseminate this guide. The Open Space Institute guide identifies characteristics of a resilient network and contains a step-by-step guide to using mapping tools. It also has case studies that show how organizations are banding together to locate and fund climate-resilient acquisitions in larger networks. A critical component of the Open Space Institute guide is the importance of communications with landowners, with land trust boards, and with the general public. We hope this program has given you some tools to speak to constituents of all political persuasions about the importance of preserving and stewarding land for climate mitigation and resilience. Social scientists say that the most important thing we can do is to talk about climate change. Clearly, land trusts play an important role in calling people to action. We hope you'll start the call in your community. And if you need help, call on us. We look forward to answering your questions in the Q&A. Thank you.